In the rolling hills of Henrico County, Virginia, where tobacco fields spread like green oceans under the blazing summer sun of 1784, the Caldwell family presided over one of the wealthiest plantations in the Commonwealth. To the outside world, they were pillars of post-revolutionary society, refined, devout, and seemingly untouchable. But inside the walls of Mill Haven Estate, a secret festered, one so monstrous that when it finally surfaced in the winter of 1789, it would shatter Virginia's aristocratic facade. Court documents sealed for over 200 years tell the story. Forged papers, a life built entirely on lies, and a young woman raised for a purpose so twisted it defies comprehension. 23 witnesses would testify to events so shocking that 3 judges refused to hear the case, claiming moral inability to proceed. The authorities tried to bury it. The church denied it ever happened. Surviving family members fled Virginia and never returned. But the truth, like it always does, eventually clawed its way back into the light. Before we delve into the nightmare that consumed Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell family's forbidden bond, let me say this. This channel exists to bring you the darkest, most unsettling true stories from America's past. If you're new here, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our weekly dives into history's deepest shadows. And in the comments, tell me, what state are you listening from? I love knowing where our community of mystery seekers is tuning in from. The papers that exposed this scandal stayed locked in the Richmond courthouse basement until 1892, when a clerk stumbled upon them while sorting through old files. His report to the Virginia Historical Society called the contents too disturbing for public release. They were sealed again for another 50 years. Our story begins in the autumn of 1776. Virginia was still reeling from revolution, its new independence raw and uncertain. Mill Haven Estate sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land. The Caldwell family had held it for 3 generations, thanks to a 1722 land grant signed by Governor Alexander Spotswood. Through carefully arranged marriages, ruthless business sense, and an unwavering obsession with preserving their fortune, they had risen to the highest ranks of the colonial elite. At the head of the family was Jonathan Caldwell, a man of imposing stature and unshakable authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples and eyes as cold as winter steel. At 42, he had already served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, commanded a thriving tobacco trade from Richmond to London, and become a widower. His wife, Catherine, born a Harrison from one of Virginia's oldest and most powerful families, had died in childbirth just months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Catherine brought not just a sizable dowry, but also unshakable social credentials, lifting the Caldwell name into the very peak of Virginia society. Their marriage, though brief, had united 2 of the most powerful tobacco fortunes in the state. The Revolution disrupted trade and destroyed old alliances, but for Jonathan, it opened doors. While others clung to loyalty to the crown, Jonathan saw opportunity in independence, not out of love for liberty, but from cold calculation. New laws, new courts, new fortunes to be made, and he intended to be among the first to seize them. He struck deals with French merchants through contacts in Philadelphia, demanding payment in gold or land deeds rather than unstable currency. When neighboring estates fell into debt, he bought them for a fraction of their worth. By war's end, Mill Haven was larger and more prosperous than ever. But there was a problem. Jonathan had no male heir. Without one, Mill Haven could be split among distant cousins after his death. a fate his grandfather had warned against in stern letters still kept in the family strongbox. A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed. See that the Caldwell name and lands remain united, no matter the sacrifice. Jonathan considered remarriage. Plenty of families quietly offered their daughters. But the thought of sharing control with another strong-willed woman like Catherine didn't sit well. He didn't want a partner. He wanted someone wholly dependent on him. Someone whose loyalty could never be questioned. And then fate, or perhaps something far more deliberate, brought Elizabeth Hartwell into his life. It was a storm-soaked night in November. Rain lashed the windows of Mill Haven's great house, while Jonathan sat in his walnut-paneled study, reviewing shipping ledgers by candlelight. The numbers told a story of near unprecedented success. Record harvests, profitable French contracts, and booming real estate investments. But as he worked, a familiar unease gnawed at him. The knowledge that all his wealth meant nothing if he couldn't secure it for future generations. Near midnight, his overseer, Samuel Bigham, appeared at the door. A lean, weathered man with 20 years of loyalty to the Caldwells. Bigham rarely disturbed Jonathan without cause. "Master Caldwell," he said gravely, "there's been an accident on the Richmond Road. A carriage overturned in the storm. Quality folk, sir." Jonathan set down his quill. Quality folk meant responsibility, and often opportunity. Bigham explained. The driver was dead. The man and woman inside had been thrown clear and killed instantly. But there was a survivor, a girl, perhaps 10 or 11. She had been thrown into the bushes, likely saving her life. She was asking for her Uncle Thomas, but remembered little else. Jonathan's mind immediately began running calculations. Orphaned children from good families could be useful in the right hands. The passengers were identified as William and Margaret Hartwell, traveling with their daughter. They had been carrying a large sum in gold, payment for land they planned to buy in the Kentucky territories. Jonathan told Bigham to bring the girl in, have her cleaned, fed, and dressed. "We'll discuss the other details," he added pointedly, "in private." An hour later, Jonathan entered the guest bedroom to find the girl sitting on the edge of a four-poster bed that had once belonged to his grandmother. Her posture was refined. Her speech was careful. Her nightgown clean and pressed by the house servants. And her face. Jonathan froze. She bore a striking resemblance to Catherine, his late wife. The same delicate jawline, the same deep, dark eyes. Her hair, once dried, was the same rich chestnut brown. "What's your name, child?" Jonathan asked softly. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she whispered. "My parents, are they truly gone?" Jonathan studied her. This was no ordinary orphan. She was educated, refined, and crucially, alone. "I'm afraid so, my dear," he said gently. "But you're safe now. Tomorrow we'll try to find this Uncle Thomas you mentioned." Even as he spoke, his mind was already spinning with possibilities. That night, under the pretense of charity, Jonathan set in motion a deception so meticulous that it would take Elizabeth more than a decade to uncover, and almost cost her life. The first letter Jonathan drafted to inquire about Elizabeth's family was never sent. Instead, it went into a locked drawer in his study, alongside a growing collection of papers telling a very different story than the one he shared with neighbors and authorities. Through quiet, methodical investigation, Jonathan learned that William and Margaret Hartwell had indeed been traveling west to meet relatives. Relatives so far into the Kentucky wilderness that letters could take months to arrive, if they arrived at all. The Hartwells had lived in Virginia for only 5 years, after moving from Maryland to run a small shipping business in Norfolk. their social circle was limited. Their disappearance could easily be blamed on the perils of frontier travel. Within a month, Jonathan's plan was complete. He appeared before the county clerk as Elizabeth's newly appointed guardian, carrying forged documents claiming that her Uncle Thomas had recently died of fever in Kentucky. The story was tragic, believable, and impossible to verify. The clerk, swamped with post-war chaos and impressed by Jonathan's standing, signed off without question. Elizabeth was now, in the eyes of the law, Jonathan's legal ward. Life at Mill Haven shifted gradually. Traumatized and isolated, Elizabeth began to accept Jonathan as her protector. He hired Miss Adelaide Fenwick, an unmarried gentlewoman from Richmond, to tutor her. She learned languages, literature, mathematics, and household management. She was dressed in fine clothes, given books to read, and treated with courtesy by the staff. To anyone watching from the outside, it seemed Jonathan was preparing her for a good marriage, perhaps to a younger son of a prominent family, or to a wealthy merchant in need of a bride with property. But Jonathan's intentions were darker. In 1778, he made a trip to Richmond to visit his lawyer, Cornelius Vance, a discreet man who had built his practice serving Virginia's elite. There, Jonathan executed a series of legal moves that revealed the true scale of his plan. First came formal adoption papers, making Elizabeth legally his daughter and sole heir in the absence of other children. To all appearances, this was a generous act of security for a girl with no family. Second came something far more unusual, a marriage contract. Not between Jonathan and any specific bride, but between himself and a woman of suitable breeding to be determined at a future date. The language was vague, the timeline indefinite, the bride unnamed. The contract stayed in Vance's private files, hidden from public record. In the years that followed, Jonathan shaped Elizabeth's education with almost obsessive precision. She learned French from a tutor, Latin from the local minister, and the complex etiquette of Virginia society from Miss Fenwick. She studied the plantation's ledgers, watched the overseer manage crops, and absorbed lessons in negotiation from Jonathan himself. And there were other lessons, quieter, more insidious. Jonathan often spoke of family loyalty above all else, of biblical patriarchs with unusual family structures, of sacrifices made to preserve bloodlines. He told her she was special, the key to preserving everything the Caldwell family had built. By 1782, Elizabeth was 16, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful. Jonathan had kept her away from men her own age, ensuring that her emotional world revolved entirely around him. Then, in the spring of 1784, he told her he had arranged a marriage with a distant cousin, also named Jonathan Caldwell. The union, he claimed, would unite two branches of the family and secure the estate for future generations. He presented her with a miniature portrait of her intended, a man who looked so much like Jonathan that they could have been brothers. The resemblance unsettled her. His clothes were slightly outdated, his expression formal, his gaze piercing. "But his name is the same as yours, Papa," she said. Jonathan explained smoothly that both were named for the same ancestor, a common tradition. Her future husband, he added, was a prosperous tobacco planter in the western counties. The wedding preparations began at once, but they were unlike any Elizabeth had seen. There would be no grand plantation celebration, no extended guest list, just a private ceremony at Mill Haven with only a handful of witnesses Jonathan personally approved. When she asked to correspond with her intended husband before the ceremony, Jonathan refused, saying the man was away on business and preferred traditional restraint. Then came the legal documents. In September, Cornelius Vance arrived at Mill Haven with a stack of papers for Elizabeth to sign. Marriage settlements, inheritance agreements, property deeds. When she asked to read them closely, both men discouraged her, claiming the legal terms were too complex and that her father had already ensured her protection. One document in particular caught her eye: a deed transferring her inheritance to someone else. Jonathan explained it away as a routine change in her legal status after marriage. But Elizabeth wasn't as naive as he believed. Her education had given her enough knowledge to suspect something was wrong. And late one night, she stumbled on the truth. She went to Jonathan's study for a book and found him at his desk, the miniature portrait beside a mirror, adjusting his hair and posture to match the painted man. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. There was no cousin. Jonathan intended to marry her himself, using a false identity to conceal the truth. Over the next days, Elizabeth began her own secret investigation. She rifled through letters, found no correspondence from any cousin, but did find bills for altering the miniature portrait and changing clothing to suit a different era. Then, while Jonathan was away in Richmond, she picked the lock of his study drawer. Inside, she found everything: the unsent letters about her parents, the forged guardianship papers, fabricated correspondence from the imaginary cousin, and, most damning, a marriage contract naming Jonathan Caldwell of Mill Haven and Elizabeth Hartwell as bride and groom. The implications left her cold. She had been raised from childhood to become his wife. Every kindness, every lesson, every restriction, it had all been part of a calculated plan. Even worse, in post-revolutionary Virginia, the arrangement wasn't necessarily illegal. As his adopted daughter, she was under his authority until marriage. As his wife, she would remain under it forever. The wedding was set for November 15th, just 3 weeks away. And then, by sheer chance, a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Hartley arrived at Mill Haven, seeking shelter for the night. Over dinner, Elizabeth asked if he knew the Hartwell family. His answer confirmed everything. Her Uncle Thomas, Margaret's brother, was alive, running a trading post near Harrodsburg, and still searching for news of his sister and niece. Jonathan's claim that the man had died years earlier was a lie. That night, Elizabeth made a decision. She would not run. She would gather evidence and she would expose Jonathan at the wedding itself. For the next 12 days, Elizabeth worked with deliberate calm, hiding her fear behind the mask Jonathan had taught her to wear. She memorized his routines, searched his study while he was inspecting the fields, and copied every incriminating document she could find. The forged guardianship papers, the fabricated cousin letters, the payment records for the men who attacked her parents' carriage, and Jonathan's own notes about their future marriage and children. But she knew that evidence alone wouldn't topple a man like Jonathan Caldwell. His wealth, influence, and social standing could smother the truth unless it was revealed in a way that could not be denied. Publicly, in front of witnesses with the authority to act immediately. The wedding would be her stage. On November 15, 1789, Mill Haven's Great Hall filled with Jonathan's carefully chosen guests: Cornelius Vance, several local magistrates, neighboring planters and their wives, and Reverend Charles Peaton to officiate. To them, this was an unusual but not unheard of arrangement. A wealthy guardian marrying his adopted daughter to keep property in the family. Elizabeth appeared in her gown, ivory silk, altered from Catherine's wedding dress. Her hair adorned with pearls, she looked pale but composed. To the guests, she was simply a shy bride. Jonathan stood beside her in a midnight blue coat. his white stock crisp, his posture radiating victory. The ceremony began with the familiar cadence of scripture and vows. Guests settled into the comfort of tradition, and then Reverend Peaton spoke the words. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Elizabeth stepped forward. I must speak, she said, her voice clear and steady. I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell, and this man murdered my parents to steal their gold and has kept me here for 13 years to force me into marriage with him. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, chairs scraping the floor. Jonathan moved to hush her, claiming bridal nerves, but Elizabeth was ready. She handed the stack of copied documents to Reverend Peaton and the magistrates. One by one, they examined the evidence, the forged papers, the fake correspondence, the payment ledgers, Jonathan's handwritten plans, and then Elizabeth delivered the final blow. Catherine Caldwell did not die in childbirth. She was poisoned by her husband when she threatened to expose his affairs. She produced Catherine's diary and a letter from Dr. Marcus Fleming describing symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. The accusations were devastating. Murder, fraud, kidnapping, and now confirmed by documentary proof in front of multiple legal authorities. Jonathan's denials rang hollow. The magistrates placed him under arrest on the spot. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational in Virginia's early history. Newspapers as far away as Boston printed the story of the plantation master who murdered for money, kidnapped a child, and groomed her for marriage. Jonathan's defense, that Elizabeth was unstable in the documents' forgeries, crumbled under the weight of her testimony and the corroborating evidence. Even his allies in Richmond withdrew, unwilling to be seen defending him. The jury convicted him on all charges: the murders of William and Margaret Hartwell, the murder of Catherine Caldwell, kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. On March 15, 1790, Jonathan Caldwell was hanged in Richmond before a crowd that included many who had once envied his fortune. Elizabeth, now legally recognized as the sole heir, used her inheritance to locate her uncle Thomas Whitfield in Kentucky. Their reunion, after 13 years, was tearful and joyous, but she was forever changed. She never married. The idea of surrendering her legal autonomy to any man was unthinkable. Instead, she poured her energy and fortune into founding schools for orphan children in Virginia and Kentucky, places where they would be educated, protected, and shielded from exploitation. Her work helped shape early child protection laws in the expanding nation. By the time she died in 1847, at 81, she was surrounded by former students, legislators, and reformers who credited her with changing lives. Mill Haven was sold to pay restitution to Jonathan's victims. The great house stood empty for years before being torn down. Locals claimed crops wouldn't grow where it had once stood, and livestock refused to graze there. The Caldwell name disappeared from Virginia's high society, erased by scandal. Jonathan's overseer, Samuel Bigham, was hanged 6 months later. Cornelius Vance fled the state but was eventually caught, disbarred, and imprisoned. The story of Elizabeth Hartwell became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and seminaries, a warning about how evil can hide behind wealth and respectability, and how the most vulnerable can be targeted under the guise of protection. Her courage that day in the Great Hall not only saved her life, but prevented Jonathan Caldwell from ever claiming another victim. And it proved that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is refusing to remain silent.